Okay, hello everyone. I'm gonna say three, two, one. Let's start live. Even though we're not live and we're recording right now. So I'd like to introduce our guest for today, Benjamin A. Boyce, and he's been very kind enough to give us the next couple hours of his time. And thank you for joining us, Benjamin.
Thanks for having me, Paul Vanderclay's Bridges of Meaning Discord server.
Our patriarch, Paul, yes, who is here. He's here today, so that's nice.
I'm glad to
He's
pitch in
just
with his
on vacation.
procrastinations. Is he?
Hmm. Yeah, that's why he's not doing it officially today, because he's on
I will speak
vacation.
with him next week and pry information out of his convalescence out of him at that time.
We look forward to it, Benjamin. Okay, so I did a little written introduction in the Q&A already, but I will just do a little vocal intro of you, Benjamin, and you can confirm or deny if I have the information correct. So Benjamin is known initially for his time at Evergreen and documenting the Evergreen Spring of 2017. He has his 24-part documentary series. We have it in the Q&A if anyone wants to check that out. And his YouTube channel. So where he kind of like looks into like culture war stuff, but I would say more than just the culture war, like what's behind it, what's going on. You've been doing a lot of delving into that world a lot as well for the past few years. And then there's the story stuff that you do on your live streams, and that's fantastic as well. So that's my little quick introduction to you, Benjamin. Is there anything you want to add?
I would say, just to expand on the long-running project that I have, it's more about gender than just about transition.
Okay.
I'm using gender as a way to speak about the reality of different lived experiences within these sexed bodies that we have, and that topic itself is vast, and everybody's got an opinion about it. It's mostly composed out of interviews.
Mhm.
And then also I have a Substack if you guys want to taste my elitism. It's alias to dream.substack.com if you're interested. There's a couple of free chapters there. You can taste what it means to be a fictionist, so far as I conceive of it.
Okay.
And we'll get
So
into
maybe you
that too,
could
because a lot of the questions that I saw were about storytelling or mythology or religion, and I think that all of those things are very tied together. And wokeism,
mhm.
there's a lot of questions of wokeism as a particular manifestation of, I guess, a religious slash theological engagement with the world and society. So
I'm going to
that's
do
how
my
I
best
come into
to
it.
pair the proper questions with the sort of the subjects that we go on. So, oh, I guess like ground rules. You guys are pretty good anyway. For these, you guys, I am one of you guys, but so I'll be asking the questions that written down, and maybe we could, if anyone who asked the question that I read after Benjamin has answered it, if you wanted to clarify or add, I'll ask if you want to add anything. And otherwise, I think at the very end, I'll ask if there's any audience questions you guys wanted to ask Benjamin directly. But otherwise, interrupting is the rules of the show I'm running. Except for me, I might interrupt. But I'll try not to, Benjamin. Um, okay, so I'll start. So I'll start with the questions about evergreen. And I'm going to start actually with Nate's question. He seems to have been a, he went to Evergreen. And so he was asking about, so is there a part of you that is a little sad about the fate of our alma mater? So I'm guessing he's
Am
one
I
of
sad
us.
about the downfall of the Evergreen State College?
Mhm.
Well, there's kind of a number of different versions of the Evergreen State College, kind of like this overlapping institution. There's the institution itself, its history, its model of education, which is particularly queer in a way. It's based around a lot of independent study and around seminars where you do a lot of discussing. With your cohort, and the way that a course would be organized, if you guys don't know this very quickly, you'll pick a theme, and then a bunch of different professors from a bunch of different disciplines would intersect upon that theme. So in the 2013-2014 school year, I took one course that was the entire year. It was called Dark Romantics, and we studied 19th century French history, literature, philosophy, and art. And so we had a historian, language teacher, a philosophical literature teacher, and an art teacher, and then a couple other teachers. And over the course of the year, we studied that particular topic from all these different vectors, or this interdisciplinary study. I think that that is absolutely fabulous. And then in the spring, we trotted off to France, and we employed our knowledge, and we all did our own personal research projects. So it's very independent oriented. So that particular model of education is it's very good for a certain type of student, a student that is very self-motivated, and I think a student that's a bit more mature in certain respects than the average student, or kind of just different. It's kind of for kind of different style of learners. And with they made certain decisions in a certain point of the history where they stopped marketing that model of education, and they just went for raw numbers, and they dropped their acceptance rate to really low or really high. It was like a 98% acceptance rate. So they were getting a lot of people into the college that weren't necessarily suited, one, to college, and two, to Evergreen's mode of education. And that's where a lot of the friction, like this undercurrent of friction within the Evergreen protests, is that a lot of those students that are acting out are not suited to college and to Evergreen specifically. On top of that, the institution had embraced social justice ideology, what we might want to call wokeism or intersectionality, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of critical theory became the central focus of the dominant culture of the college, and racism was marked out to be the defining theme of our time, of histories, to solve or to end racism. So that is how we got to the Evergreen protest. So am I sad that it failed? I think that I am disappointed that the participants and the college itself never did an actual self-evaluation, and to really critically examine how their beliefs led to the failure of the college as a teaching institution in 2017. They instead doubled down and doubled down and doubled down on this equity stuff, whatever that means, and refused to learn the lesson, and tried to cover up the reality or the outcome of what they were teaching. And they still want to teach it, um, but they're losing students. So I'm disappointed that they didn't fess up and actually evaluate that. And so my job, in a certain respect, with regards to my work on Evergreen, is to provide the college what it refused to do for itself, which is a critical evaluation of the experiment it ran under the umbrella of social justice.
Mm. Okay, so going along the theme of our institutions, I'll ask, so Robert, oh, sorry, Nate, are you around? Did you want to, oh, I don't see you in the chat. Okay, so you can't do a follow-up. So Robert is impressed with your bathrobe wearing machismo. Machismo? Is that how you say it? Anyway, so good job. That's the first part, just to say
Machismo.
machismo. Okay, yeah. So I had to include that. And but the actual question is, like, do you have hope for the future of our educational institutions? And if so, from where does this hope come?
I think that the American education, well, okay, so American education system is supported by the federal government to a certain degree, but there's a lot of wiggle room for each individual state to employ how that operates. And then there's higher education, and then I guess pre-higher education. What's that called? Just school, grade school, high school, that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So within my state of Washington, the governor, in his infinite wisdom, has decided to scale up evergreen and push the evergreen model of equity and training across all levels of schooling, from kindergarten to 12th grade, and then also throughout higher education. So everybody's going to be taking these yearly training courses and then be evaluated after the end of these training courses. So with that going on, and I think that that's part of the reason why Evergreen State College as a story was completely covered up and denied or ignored by the governor and by the Democrats in the state, because they were ultimately, I think that the plan was to roll it out at Evergreen and then scale it up. It blew up at Evergreen. They ignored it. They're still going ahead. They're going to go ahead, even though the populace voted against this stuff. They're still really dead set on
Oh,
pushing this stuff out. So we'll see to what degree that actually affects every level of education. I think that equity is ultimately anti-meritocratic. It's equitocratic. It's based on outcomes. It's based on reducing people into statistics and into identities, and then trying to equalize the playing field. But you can't equalize intelligence, wit, and curiosity. You can't equalize determination. And the albeit imperfect form of evaluation that runs under the name of meritocracy, although meritocracy is imperfect, there's a lot of people that game that system. I think it's much better in its imperfection than what is coming down the pipes under equity. Equity is a centralized form of predetermining some sort of standard and then trying to even out disparities by focusing on external or systemic and identitarian markers rather than internal compulsion. So insofar as they go down that route and then shove down the throats of all the teachers and all the students this needing to be that justice, whatever that means, is the ultimate that justice and equity is what they actually want to teach everybody. And justice has a very specific meaning, which means disrupting and dismantling systems, all systems throughout every form of order, every form of order. To what degree that will catch on, to what degree everybody will disrupt and dismantle our systems of not just education, but everything that follows from education, which would be the workplace and the government and all of our infrastructure. We'll see to what extent that will wreak havoc or just stall out our society in Washington. So I'm not looking hopeful to the people who are in charge of education now, and they are very resistant to being dissuaded or told not to do what they're doing. So they're going to do this, and it's going to be implemented. So we'll see to what degree people will actually realize what's happening, and it's going to take some time.
okay. So the future will tell, I suppose. Okay. So the next question I'll ask is, so further beyond Eddie is asking about what if you could give a percentage. I don't know if this is possible. Can you give a percentage of how wrong would you say is the woke worldview? And if you could magically change one thing about it, about woke, what would it be? Can you define woke first, please?
Me?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's this guy, I think he does this series of lectures, Princeton lecture series on critical theory and our literary criticism. And it's not necessarily what we think of as critical theory when we're talking in the James Lindsay interpretation of wokeism. But I think his name's Fry. I was going to look it up before we got on, but I forgot to do that. So he does this series of lectures about literary criticism, and he uses this very simple story throughout the entire like 20 episodes, and it's like a Thomas the Train Engine story where there's a train and another train, and there's this problem with this hill, and there's this very simple arc of happening within that story. And the brilliant thing about this lecture series is that he uses that story and he takes that story and then he applies these different forms of literary criticism to that story. And there's all these different forms of literary criticism dating back, it actually really derived a lot from biblical studies or hermeneutics. And then you have all these different postmodern versions, and you have as well, like queer theory, feminist theory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And over the course of that lecture series, you get to have a sense that the story remains the same, but the meaning that's being derived out of the story changes. So I think just to make a tweet, a very low resolution tweet about a very complex topic, that we are religious beings insofar as we make sense of the world through story. And we are theological beings insofar as we derive from the story that we are projecting onto the world meaning. We interpret the story that we project onto the world. And there's different forms of criticism, postmodern criticism, that tries to attack the story itself or to dismantle and disrupt the actual action of making a narrative. And then there's a bunch of different theories of attacking how we make meaning out of those narratives. So there's basically two different ways also, on the other hand, not just being creative or not just being critical, but being creative, of engaging with the story, engaging with the world, learning all these different stories, and then seeing which story makes sense. And then also being aware that when you're telling a story, there's always a moral or some sort of secondary derivation that you're extracting from the story that will always be there, which serves the story, but also tries to master the story. So I'm going to say that again. Criticism or interpretation serves the story and tries to master the story by saying what the story means. So a lot of religious discourse for me is questioning, well, okay, you have this story that you're projecting onto the world, and then you have all these theories that you're applying to the story that you're projecting onto the world. And you can see what's more real or what's more useful. How do we translate our phenomena into a story, and how do we translate meaning from the story? So that being said, as the groundwork for what I'm going to try to talk about, wokeness is a certain story and a certain interpretation of the story. And if you start to look at what wokeness is, in its essence, is that they tell the story that there's these systems, and these systems are unfair. And if you look at history, you can see that they are unfair, that there are winners and losers, basically. And the winners are usually extracting their winnings from the loser. There's not really a lot of creation of value. There's mostly just theft of value. There's kind of this zero sum or very net negative progress in history. And so wokeness is recognizing the disparity in the world and then trying to correct that disparity. The tools that they use to correct that disparity are derived also from this understanding of this victim, victor, or oppressed, oppressor dynamic that they project onto everything. And once that is the major plot arc and the major story that's going on, you have eventually you get certain sorts of, in my opinion, you have certain sorts of behaviors that follow from that narrative structure and from the interpretation of the narrative structure that you're projecting into the world. And from what I see, a lot of what we call wokeness is a certain sort of certainty of moral rightness, a certain sort of urgency of changing things, and a certain sort of, what's it called when you can't stand any sort of questions or criticism? A certain sort of squashing of any sort of, yeah, certain intolerance in the project of tolerance. There's certain sorts of intolerance towards any sort of criticism, and so they manifest these linguistic games where they call what they're doing anti-racist, right? So just on the surface of that, to critique anti-racism means that you're on the side of racism. To be against any one of these movements, Black Lives Matter, linguistically, you're therefore, in this very binary dialectical way of thinking, you're therefore against Black Lives Mattering, you're against the rights of people. You're for some sort of phobia. You are a bigot if you're questioning these things. You are a racist or you're an anti-racist, and there's nothing in between those things. And that, so you get these really chunky, impossible situations as far as dialogue is concerned. And then you have a bunch of people with this pretended moral authority going through and demanding that all these institutions that, let's just say with education, it's about teaching skills. No, education is not about teaching skills. It's about teaching how to change the world. We don't want to understand the world. We want to change the world because we already understand the world. And the most fundamental understanding of the world is that is unfair. So we need to make it more fair. So we have to somehow equalize the disparity that we see. I'm rambling, so I don't know
Oh,
where we are.
you're
Andrea,
not
could you
rambling. It's fine.
help me out?
I'm just looking at what the next question will be anyway. So like, please keep going. No, but you are you can finish up if you want,
I
or do
just,
you legit?
what was the question? Could you repeat the question? That there was you wanted me to define wokeness, so I went on a
I
long kind
okay.
of
So
pre-definition.
I oh you were still you're right. You were rambling. Sorry. No, it was I asked and I knew it would be a hard thing to do because wokeness is it's a hard concept to define because it's sort of this it's new it's new it's a new thing anyway so if you could change one thing about wokeness um what would you change?
Well, it would have to do, I think that it would ultimately have to do with that very fundamental kind of understanding of what it is as an ideology. It's the marriage of an interpretation of a story that's being thrust onto the world. So if you could somehow change that basic story and somehow say that value is created, and that, yeah, somehow the value is created over and beyond it being stolen, and that there's a positive influence in the way that human beings interact with the raw material world, where through invention and through grace and through compassion and through personal development, we actually make more out of what is already there, rather than always being at this zero sum kind of status of oppressor and oppressed. If you could somehow change
Mm.
that, I think that everything else would follow.
But would it still be wokeness then just even changing that one thing?
Well, the thing is, wokeness is actually technically from the Black community. And if you actually ask people in the Black community what it means in a positive sense, they will say that it's being aware of the disparity that Black individuals within America experience every day. So even
Okay.
on that level, even going back to the roots of it, it's still fundamentally flawed, in my opinion, because it's adulating, or it's bringing out, it's making more conscious a negative, a net negative view of the world. And it sets, I guess, it sets you up to being against that which is against you, rather than being for something that would transcend that which is against you, rather than
Right.
transcending the situation and the history by creating forms of art or innovation or something like that. It sets you up against this system and this historical project that is, literally killing you and providing all this negative stuff. And I'm not in any way meaning to disparage or to underwrite the negative history specifically in that
Hmm.
community, for that community, or in, society at large. I'm just saying, if you look at that, mostly if you base your world on that step as the first step, where do you eventually end up?
Right. Okay. Okay, so I'll move on to this next question. So it's Dan, and okay, this is written in like an old English font, so I'm not sure if it's a W or an M. So Dan Walther or Malther. So I apologize, Dan, you're not chat, but if I mispronounced your last name. So there once was this live stream where you presented your woke creation myth. You later presented your theory that in order for the woke to persist, they need to create a sound epic. Should there be a timeless work that people will find at least hilarious 100 years from now? Should this epic be written by the reasonable? Do the woke gods, small case g gods, have have two less to manifest in bodily form in story in order to be effectively critiqued? There's a lot there.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So I did start that. Let me really quickly see if woke. Let's see if I can find that. I won't waste too much of your time on that. But if you start to play around with mythology, so one of my perennial desires from, I think it was 18. I went to Bible college in Canada, Covenant Bible College in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, which has since closed. And during the spring, we took a choir tour, and we went from Saskatchewan westward to Vancouver, then down to Seattle, and then back up again. And when we were in Seattle, we had some free time. We were let loose upon the city, and I stumbled into a small little bookstore, and I was really, really poor, and I had like $5, and there was this tiny little Dover print of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell by William Blake, which is just a fabulous little, totally insane tract and so imaginative. And he's got like proverbs, and he's got these parables, and he's got these really crazy dream sequences. And I was reading that on the drive back, and my brain was just lighting up. It was just lighting up. I'm like, oh, I couldn't believe you can write just aphorisms. You can just write a sentence. Like, you could just do that. You don't have to write a whole novel. You could do that. And he also had these passages where and he calls out specifically, he wrestles with the notion of a received wisdom or of a holy book. And it's been a long time, so I'm going to butcher this, but it seemed like he was arguing that the Spirit is ever present, and you don't need to rely on what has come before. If you attain the Spirit directly, you can manifest directly the Spirit. And what he did in a literary way to display that, or to show that, to work that out, is that he had this conversation with Ezekiel and Elijah, or Isaiah it was. And he took those characters from the Bible and turned them into fiction and had this fictional conversation with them. And that blew me away too, that this holy book that I'd grown up with, my dad's a pastor, I've been in church forever, that you could actually approach the Bible creatively. You can start to play around and retell those stories, and you could do that. That was an open field. That was an open canvas. That was turned into a pile of Legos for me in a certain respect. And so, I'm 18, I'm 19, and I start to try to do that. I start to try to write in that form of sense making, that mythological form of sense making. And I saw that it was really fruitful, but it took a lot of work. And I started rewriting. Well, I started doing this game where I played around with children of Adam and Eve. I've spoken about this with Andrea before, but in that I had to try to figure out, well, how do these characters act at that level of existence? How do we start to make a mythology? It has a certain sound to it. It has a certain consistency or thickness and density of thought that you're dealing with, and over the course of my time wrestling with how to do that productively, how to play around with that, and then create something that makes sense out of that, I got this aesthetic understanding of how to deal on that level of storytelling. And I started to understand the parameters of that form of sense making. You can't just go in and make up a myth, because it has certain rules. Or if you make a myth, you have to understand that what you're doing is you're setting up very fundamental rules for a world that then, if you multiply and speed up through time, you'll have certain outcomes. So when we engage, let's say, with the project of taking the woke doctrine and then trying to get down into the roots of how it makes sense, and then anthropomorphizing those roots into characters or into gods, once you understand how to play around with gods, then you can do that. But once you do that, then you're translating you're kind of reverse engineering a mythology out of the behaviors that you see and all these ideas, all these philosophical ideas, and you're having to use your imagination. And you have to suspend doing it in a very intentional way. You use your imagination to kind of just recreate it and enter into a dreamlike engagement with that. So just to try to wrap up, do the woke gods have too less manifestation body and story in order to be effectively critiqued? No, you can totally translate a modern phenomena through the lens of mythology, or use mythology to try to interpret uh, modern phenomena, modern social political phenomena. And that's why Paul Vanderklay and Jonathan Peugeot have such a rich field of discourse to engage with, and that's why they are able to create so much content. And Jordan Peterson too. They create so much content because they are participating in this discourse, this literary discourse, where they're engaging both religiously and theologically. That is, they're engaging both with a narrative and understanding that they're engaging with narratives, and they're engaging with interpretation of narratives, and they understand the fundamentals of how both narrative and interpretation work. And so you can do that. You can apply that to anything you want, and it's kind of fun. And then you also get to have, it also becomes really funny when you do that. I'm not going to waste your time by pulling up the woke Bible. I got up to Abraham with that story.
Well, I actually did listen. I listened to that one where you did the woke narrative, and I thought it was really beautiful what you wrote. I didn't even think it was funny. I thought that, like, if they had this, that it would be better for them in the world if they adopted it. But
It gets,
anyway.
I have to finish it because it gets, I can already tell how perverse it's going to get by the time you get like a woke Jesus on the scene. Like that's ultimately
Okay.
wanted to do, get to a woke Jesus. And it gets really, really weird because I can feel the woke Jesus in the form, not Jesus as a historical
Okay.
individual, not Jesus as a divine individual, but Jesus as a literary individual, Jesus as an
Mm-hmm.
aphorist. Jesus was very literary. He was a brilliant aphorist. And that's why, there's Bibles that actually just put his words in red. It's because of
Mm-hmm.
what he said and how he spoke and how he engaged literarily. If you take intersectional wokeness and you sieve it through the style of speaking of Jesus, you can already hear some really crazy things that he's saying, and these twists of logic that he's doing as a character.
Okay. Well, looking forward to that manifestation then.
No
Um,
promises.
don't stop. Keep going because we're all wanting to see
Don't stop.
woke Jesus. Um, okay, so I'm gonna move on. We'll circle back to some of these the other woke questions because I would like to get into the narrative questions and the religion questions, particularly. Um, so Gomer Day has the question about, to what extent is the current social justice movement a religion, and what are similarities and differences between religions and modern social justice warriors, and what impacts of the arrival what is called the non-religious religions. So there's a lot of questions here. So let's just start off first with the similarity of between wokeness as a religion. Is it a religion?
Okay, so
We
we've
kind of
already
alluded
established
to this.
that in
Yeah.
the way that I view or I interact with historical or modern phenomena is through story, and so I can take that religious metaphor. This is a new religion, writes John McWhorter, but everybody's been writing that and saying that for decades now. They're saying like, okay, here's this religion, even back when it infected. Am I tearing? Is my volume too high? Back when we were watching the new atheist group separate themselves and dismantle religion, you watch
Hmm.
that group, I think it's in the 2010s, they become super hyper moral. And this
Mm.
social justice warriorism, which we now call wokeness, but it's just we change our terms just as much as woke people do, because the terms we use get abused and recycled and rehashed and cringy. We have to come up with new terms. But you see that in the absence of a narrative structure, people will start to create a narrative structure. People will start to coincidentally view the world and impress value upon that world. Now, in a post-narrative form of ideology, you don't have a story. You have this theory, or you have this other kind of value set. where there's this kind of these axiomatic truths, I guess. I don't know how you would actually form that, but yeah, if you're thinking of a philosophy, the mythology of a philosophy would be those axioms that start the entire philosophy, right? The mythology within a religion is those axiomatic narrative structures that from which everything else in the religion flow. In the absence of a
Mhm,
narrative religion, you have, what do you have? You have people trying to
mhm.
coincidentally make moral sense of the world. And the problem that I can see forming over and over again is that without intentionally understanding that there's a narrative that we're projecting on the world and an interpretation of that narrative, people will start to mix those or put those two things together in different ways. They'll start to claim what is right and wrong, and then later on tell you why something's right or wrong. So I guess
Okay,
the axiomatic principles of what we social justice is that there is the downtrodden. There is, it starts with I guess on racial lines. There's this hierarchy of you know, of advantage and disadvantage, sexual disparities. I guess you can invent this category of gender, and you can invent all these other categories: socioeconomic status, I guess religious or cultural status. There's all these different things, and you say that the people on the bottom need help to get back up, and then you start to protect the people on the bottom by putting taboos around certain ways of negatively or of ascribing negative value to group. Let's just say being racist is now a cardinal sin. Being sexist is now a cardinal sin. And I'm sorry, you guys should probably tell me if it's a cardinal or a mortal sin. I can't remember the difference between those two. But
the
what
chief
we
of
have
sins,
now,
not whatever.
okay. Yeah, yeah, I don't know the difference, but right now what we have is that racism, sexism, and all these phobias are the cardinal or mortal sins of current discourse. So you have the sins, and you kind of have this story behind it, or this religious kind of understanding behind it. But because that religion or that narrative structure can't be a- accurately contained, it's hid behind all this theory. It's hid behind all of this, I guess you would say, this confession in the case of Ta-Nehisi Coates, or in these screeds. And I don't mean that necessarily negatively, but kind of negatively, because I think negatively of both Robin DiAngelo with white fragility theory and Ibram X. Kendi with anti-racist theory. They have this story that's more or less historical and that is very rigid, and it's very white and black. It's very Manichaean
Mm,
when it comes to
mhm.
Kendi. And then you have this interpretation that's bound up in the story at the same time. So I sorry, I'm losing the thread again. I'm losing the thread. Do oh
About
who
the questions?
yeah, what was the question again?
Oh, no, no, you're not losing it. Don't worry. I'm keeping track. So I actually think that that was a good answer. But okay,
Okay.
Gomer Day, I see that you are in the chat.
Gomer
Is
Day.
there any clarification on your question before I move on? Because there's another question that's actually similar, but you brought up the new atheists, and it kind of has to do with them a little bit. But so Gomer Day, is that how you pronounce it? I don't. I'm doing my best. No? Speak now or forever hold your mute. Okay. Um, I'm gonna move on. Okay, Josh has a question that is sort of similar, but going on to the sort of science mythology, materialist mythology. So if we define mythology as a sense of meaning making models of reality explained in story or narrative,
Mhm,
would you
mhm,
consider that definition for a
mhm,
moment and consider the modern scientific belief in regards to it? So,
mhm,
to clarify, I would say that Darwinian evolution is typically explained to people in terms of an unfolding story. And the same with beliefs held by cosmologists, such as the story of the Big Bang. How do you feel about common currently held scientific beliefs being called mythology?
So I guess just to add on to something previous, and I'll work towards a scientific or understanding science as some sort of system of belief, or how belief operates within a scientific framework or in a scientific world, rather than the scientific process, which is two different things. We have scientific process that brings us to all these benefits, and then we kind of reverse engineer this belief in science itself, when science is just this sort of processing of falsifiability, right? It's just this weird kind of munching mechanism that gives us more or less stable understanding of how the material world and maybe the biological world and maybe the human world operate. It's kind of this way of generating understanding. It's not anything in and of itself. It's the absence of belief, but people end up believing in it because they live in a scientific world. They end up forming some sort of narrative structure of what human beings are in relation to all these different phenomena, in relationship to each other, and in relationship to society in general. Dang it. I lost my thread. I was going to say something, but that was basically what I'm going to say about, I don't know to what extent belief operates, to what extent are we being aware of how belief operates, to what extent can we have either a belief structure that's stable enough so that we don't have to enforce it in a very fundamental, I'm not fundamentalist way, but in a very, one aspect of wokeness that you see over and over again, or you see it within cancel culture, you see it in the way that people are policing discourse, is that they have a certain sort of belief. And my question is it the belief that causes them to be so hardcore with enforcing that belief? Or is their relationship of believing in this moral truth somehow to blame, or somehow the cause of how they are trying to enforce their belief and eradicate contrariness to that belief in a way, in certain respects. So I think that one big question, but one big exploration of mine that I'm interested in continually coming back to, is what is the capacity to believe? So if we have this narrative structure that we're projecting out of the world, or that we're inheriting from our society or from our ancestors and projecting out of the world, and then we have this theological inheritance of interpretation of that story, in what capacity is our belief attaching us to those stories and then causing us to replicate those stories, to not just see that and understand that, but to actively impress those stories onto the world through our behavior, and our behavior being a moral behavior. Is it good or is it bad? Do I do this or do I do that? And science does have some sort of simulacra of morality, and but it's no longer in a moral kind of morality. It's this true or false dichotomy of what is good science and what is bad science. So there's still some sort of evaluation and some sort of process of evaluation from which is strained through conversation and through data, this kind of, this more or less kind of shifting but progressing more or less project that science is promoting on this. To what degree can a human being that's made out of matter and made out of biology and made out of this gray matter and then made out of psychology and then made out of culture, to what degree can a human being with this capacity of belief actually adhere to a scientific worldview and be satisfied by a scientific worldview? To what degree, what is the end of science? To what degree does the narrative or the project of science end and leave room for more, just leave room for something more for human beings to cling to as social creatures and as individual creatures, that some of them every once in a while might be seeking some sort of understanding of a very, very deep level of consciousness, which we could just kind of call spirituality or spiritual understanding. To what degree does science give you that? I don't know. So it has its bounds.
Okay. That
Okay.
is the $1,000,000 question. Sorry. Yeah, okay. So I think that the next one that would make the most sense would be, so Luke Thompson's question is, if the deepest level of any person's true belief is trust in another person, what does the extreme overemphasis on depersonalized information and facts mean for our culture? How can this be ameliorated? And I had to double check how to pronounce that. Ameliorated.
So the deepest level, what's the name so I could read this myself?
Luke.
What's the
So
name?
Luke Thompson.
Luke,
So if the deepest
Luke
level of any
Thompson.
person's true belief is trust in another person.
Okay. Well, that's a big if. Is
Yeah,
the
because
deepest
could you
level
not
of a
trust like in
human's
a God more?
true belief? Well, wouldn't you have to first trust in yourself? Wouldn't you have to first trust in your belief or your capacity to believe before you could actually have an understanding of what belief is actually doing? See, this is one problem that I have that we need to solve before we can have the religious conversation, before we can actually start to mess around with the mechanics of religion proper. We need to understand what belief is and to what degree is a human being capable of believing in something that's superhuman, right? To what is the purpose of belief? What is that? What is the entire function of that? If you go into what a story is, there's this quote by Coleridge where he says something to along the lines of a willful suspension of disbelief is how people play along with the story. When you're reading some sort of fantastic narrative, you are suspending your disbelief. I argue with that as being completely inverse to what a narrative is actually doing. When you are paying attention to a story, you are investing your belief. You're investing first your attention to the story, and then that attention coagulates into belief where your attention starts to take the story, the characters, and the world and all the actions and reconstitute it in the mind and your imagination. So belief as a function of the imagination, holding on to an intellectual form, holding on, this ability to hold on to a story through time is something it takes. That's kind of like a factor of the human brain and our ability to have both meaning and memory, but basically that's the imaginative capacity. So what is the bounds of the imaginative capacity? What is the bounds of our ability to believe in something, to sustain an understanding or sustain a relationship to a thing? So get back to the question, if the deepest level of any person's true belief is trust in another person, in order to have trust, you would have to have experience of the person. And in order to have trust, you would have to sustain that experience of a person and hold on to that in your mind. You would have to create a stable form of that person, this kind of basically this fictitious person that you have gathered out of every interaction with the real person you have. You create this kind
Mhm.
of fictional model of a human being, and that human being you start to trust, or you start to sustain a certain sort of expectation of behavior from that model of the person in your head. If that person deviates from that in a little bit of a way, you can learn more, you can update that model. If a person actually does something that harms you, um, or and really shatters that expectation, you might have to completely reassemble that model of them in your head. So if you go around in your life and you say the models of people in my head are the lowest form of my understanding, they are the truest of true believing, is the models I've made out of other people, you have to understand that those models are fictitious. Those models will have to be constantly upgraded. And then you have to actually trust in something greater than the models you're making in your head. You have to have an even lower understanding or a conscious level understanding that you plant your feet upon. Like what's the lowest
Mhm.
level of belief is that I exist, right? You would have to do some sort of experiment like Descartes did. Like, I believe,
Mhm.
therefore I am. No, I don't believe. I experience, therefore I am. And through belief, I can start to understand experience through, and then I can understand myself, and then I can understand other people or the models that I make of other people, and the process by which I can accurately and functionally or healthily update those models and have some sort of stable understanding of people, but not too stable, right? And let me get to
Hmm.
the actual question. So I
Yeah.
had to set up
Yes.
that question.
Hmm.
What does the extreme overemphasis on depersonalized information and facts mean for our culture? How can that be ameliorated? To what
Thank you
degree
for
are
that.
facts to what degree are facts impersonal? To what degree can any form of believing in something or making a model of something that you stabilize enough to start to predict how it will operate in order for you to have a stable relationship, have a stable life, have a job, function in the world anyway, to what degree can any of the phenomena that we experience and then create models out of can be, to what degree can that be strained from the fingerprints of that which we are, which is persons? To what degree can we actually touch something impersonally? With how do we not get our grubby hands of personalizing on anything? We always are taking things personally to a greater or lesser degree. And with training, with certain sorts of training, you can have a more and more impartial relationship with facts. And we hope that somebody like a judge can really um, use a low level of personalizing the information that he or she is interacting with. And in the case of a scientist that's looking at phenomena, we hope that there are
Mhm.
processes in place that can sieve the personalization out of that. But when it comes to one, average people, and two, average people acting as a group, there will always be a personalization of any sort of information going on. And I think that, in a sense, to wrap up, I think that this emphasis on identity is some sort of depersonalizing personalization of a human being. Identity is a attempt to depersonalize the personal, or to make personal that which is impersonal, which would be my signifier in the world. And they are containers for the person, but you'll notice that it just makes sense. I like this phrase. I've been saying it too much in my head, but an identity is not a personality. There's all these things that aren't a personality, but an identity is not a personality. There's something more than the person that we're trying to fit into these identitarian categories. And the identity means so much because of the political way that we are now treating identities, or the project of social justice, which would be to save or correct the world by means of identity, or looking at people as identities and trying to change try in the best possible way, trying to make better the people in these groups that are statistically likely to be worse off than other groups. And so somehow, in the currency of interaction on the internet through social justice, but also through our bios, our Twitter bios and our Facebook, the sieving of ourselves through the network of social media has caused us to coagulate into these identities. And identities, they're both personal and impersonal in a way. I don't know how to wrap
Mm.
that up. Now I'm just riffing out loud.
No, it's no,
Next question.
no, it's good. It's identities. I actually think that you saying that we are not our identities is a good sort of wrap up for that. I'm going to think
Hmm.
about that one actually. So, okay, I'll move over to CW's question. Does religious philosophy play a role in your efforts to sway contemporary discourse towards reasonable ways of relating person to person and having some fun while doing so? So, do you ever use religious philosophy
Who
in
could you
this?
tell me the name so I can see that in front of
CW.
me when I lose the plot?
CW. It's near the
Does
top
religious philosophy
of the
play a
questions.
role? Religious philosophy. Religious philosophy. Well, again, that's theology, right? So religious philosophy, religion defined as the narrative that we project on the world or inherit and then project on the world, and then theology being the interpretation of that. Philosophy would be probably another way of saying interpretation, but some form of interpretation that has this thing called critical thinking going on in it. And whenever somebody
Mhm.
says that we need more critical thinking, I ask them to define that, and nobody can ever define it. So I can't define it yet. I should try to think, what is
I
critical
was going to
thinking? There
ask,
should
can
be some
you?
sort of, can I? Yeah, right. So so I think philosophy would be a more critical thinking version of theology, which would
Hmm.
be, I guess, even more strained of story than theology is, uh, in a way, or trying
But do
to
you
take on a
use that
voice that's
then or not
impersonal.
really?
Well, see, I don't know what I do. Everything that,
Okay.
so what have I been doing for the entire conversation that we've had? I've been doing some sort of religious philosophy. I've been doing some sort of talking around concepts, trying to build an argument by saying, this is my term. I have narrative and I have interpretation of narrative, and I'm going to play around with those ideas to try to make
Mhm.
sense and try to connect everything that I say when the conversation flows to the next question, to have some sort of overarching consistency while I'm talking. So I am kind of
Mhm.
storytelling in a way. I have my characters. If you look at it this way, my characters for this story that I'm telling right now are narrative and interpretation. Now, they're not as personal as, let's say, we have Cain and Abel, and we walk Cain and Abel through that. And we say, okay, well, Cain means something like this, Abel means something like that. Then we're going to go to this other lens of talking about Cain and Abel. And here's a great example. Nietzsche's first major work was Birth of Tragedy. And he set up this narrative structure where you have the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And the Apollonian has all of these characteristics, and the Dionysian has all these characteristics. And then he just interprets all of these different phenomena according to those two extremes. And he creates this very
Mm.
rudimentary story. And he's actually, it's an early work. And you can see that he develops his narrative ability to be a little bit more flexible with the narrative structure, and thus Sprach Zarathustra, where he's really dealing with symbols and stuff like that. And the interpretation is serving the symbol, and the symbol becomes much more important than the philosophizing about the symbol, at least in that work. And then his works subsequent to that, which were more philosophical in nature, he's interpreting more than storytelling, even though he does all this poetry and stuff like that. So I think that there's in the work that I do as a YouTube talker, as a meaning, I was trying to define, what do I do? I'm not a journalist. I try to tell the truth and I try to tell stories, but I'm not really that good at being truthful and adhering to stories that well. Evergreen was a fluke. I think, I don't know when I'm going to do that. So I'm not really a journalist. I was kind of critiquing myself. I'm kind of an interviewer, but what am I doing when I'm interviewing? What am I trying to do when I'm interviewing? I'm just being an investigator. So there's that going on. But when I just sit down in front of a camera and I talk about a phenomena and try to make sense out of it, that's kind of what people get to know me as somebody who's making sense out of things. I'm in the
Mm.
modality of a interviewer. I am somebody known for my listening skills, which is a set of
Mhm.
skills, and then my asking skills, which is a set of skills, and then my trying to recapitulate what the person said, condense it down so that I know that I understand it and that the audience understands it, so we can go on to the next thing. So I'm always doing a form of storytelling. I think that that's one way of doing it, but my storytelling is filled with meaning making. I'm always interpreting and telling a story at the same time. And it
Mhm.
becomes very explicit that I'm a storyteller in my fiction. But
Mhm.
when I'm talking about, some sort of weird, uh, what I don't want to cuss on here, some sort of really weird op-ed at the New York Times or something like that, some sort of piece of writing, and I'm interpreting that, I'm still kind of making a story out of it, and I try to be aware of when I'm interacting with the storytelling and when I'm interacting with the meaning making that serves the story and tries to rule the story by saying what the story means. So
Mm.
I guess that's all kind of religious and kind of philosophical. And the way
Okay.
I hope to sway contemporary discourse towards reasonable ways of relating precedes what I do. The way that I try to sway
Oh.
contemporary discourse precedes what I'm actually doing. What I'm actually trying to do before I do anything is be real, is be authentic, is to be relaxed, is to be joyful, is to be
Mm.
right in myself and with the world. And then from that, proceed into the activity so that my activity, chinks in my activity, little glimpses around what I'm doing reflects back on a understanding, pre-active state of what I hope to be something close to what I think of as the divine, or what I think of as
Mm.
what reality is and what we are called to be within reality. That is something that I can never speak of directly, but I hope to, in my enduring attempt, is to have that woven through everything that I do, right? Because
Okay.
that's what will ultimately sway. If you want to sway anything, you have to get into the roots. And if you want to sway public discourse, the roots of public discourse are human beings. How do you change a human being's attitude? How do you change
Mm.
their state of being? You have to project that state of being and then stimulate them on top of that.
Mm. Good stuff, Boyce. Good stuff.
Much, 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 much.
Okay. So, oh, that was a really good question, but I can't think about it because we have to move on. So, okay, we're going to go to Jake Bowen. Curtis Yarvin, aka I don't know how to pronounce this, so I'll do my best. Mencius
Mencius.
Moldbug. Are
Mencius.
you
I think
aware?
it's Mencius.
Mencius. Mencius. Okay. I wasn't sure if it was like Lucius Malfoy, but it's not. So anyway, okay,
That's a good question.
has been saying since 2007 that what we recognize as wokeness today is more or less how progressivism slash liberalism has always operated. That this is merely the most recent iteration of a trend that can be tracked back through the Protestant main line to Puritanism, to the Whigs, to the Calvinists, to the Reformation, etc. Have you or any IDW folks you talked to engaged with Yarvin's analysis? And if so, thoughts?
This is something I think about a lot without thinking about it directly. And I think about it
Mm-hmm.
metaphorically by saying, these people are being puritanical.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking today,
Mm-hmm.
oh man, how political do we want to get? I'm trying to figure
Oh,
out
you go
how.
full, go on, go, just do it.
Okay, here we go. I'm trying to
Here we
figure
go.
out as honestly as possible and by connecting with direct resources, to what degree is what's called trans rights activism a descendant of feminist discourse? To what degree did feminism use certain
Mm-hmm.
sort of rhetorical tools to get its sway on the body politic and change policy and change attitudes and change our language and change our story about what a woman is? To what degree do the tools that feminists, and there's all these different kinds of feminists, so it's an imperfect question to begin with, but to what degree are the tools that were used to change our stories about women now being employed to change our stories about sex itself and
Mm-hmm.
gender itself? Like, to what degree did feminism upset gender roles, and to what degree are those gender roles now coming back in a vengeance in a post-gender world, right? And then what
Mm-hmm.
is this whole thing about gender and this entire fantastical, like all these different kinds of sexualities and all these different kinds of identities that are like, what are you even basing this stuff off of? Like, and they
Mm-hmm.
have a sexuality for everything. It's just like, okay, to what degree does that mean anything? To what degree does it not mean anything, right? And to what degree does that follow from a feminist critique? To what degree is gender studies related to women's studies, and where did women's studies come from? Where did all these different steps come from? So yeah, I am interested in the historical, rhetorical kind of process of these different kinds of things. And then ultimately you have to ask, well, to what degree did liberalism seed anti-liberalism as we see it now? To what degree is it a constant battle that's being played out over and over again? I think Paul had something very recent about this, and I haven't had time to listen to it. So I look actually to Paul to learn a lot about the historical context and Paul's guests. That's how I kind of get that. But I kind of think in the back of my head, well, what's the antidote to a liberalism if liberalism or progressivism and all these other isms that you put forth are all a part of the whole thing? Right. So I have to go back into, I don't understand all the history and I don't have the attention to absorb it all and believe in it enough to sustain it in my head to actually reconstitute it to an audience. My capacity of imagination or my capacity of belief is very unstable to begin with. It's incredibly unstable. So I don't hold historical facts in my head, like they dissolve, because I break them down into the ideas, and then I turn the ideas into characters in my head, and then I kind of constantly play around with those things. So I'm really bad at that axis of meaning making and stuff. But so I try to figure out what's similar in the storytelling of these different movements and how would I counter it with a different story. So I keep on going back to first principles for me, or like all my guests. I try to go in, okay, where do we begin? And this ties into my fiction. Where do we begin? In the beginning, what? In the beginning, what?
Mm-hmm.
And just constantly returning to, let's start the world over, let's start the conversations over, let's recast the terms into a different genre and see how they play out in this other genre, this other lens of critiquing or story building or story making or dreaming. Um,
Mm.
So I don't know. Those are really good questions, and I'm not prepared to actually give a satisfactory answer, but thank you for letting me riff on that.
So, well, okay, I'm going to go to this one question in a minute about gender roles in our society, but I'm going to first ask Cassidy's question because I think it's a really important question. So, who, in your opinion, does a good job supporting and promoting the left or even woke ideas? What do they provide in the conversation, and why do you find them helpful?
Who asked that question?
Oh, come on. Come
Who?
on.
Okay,
That's
I see it.
Cassidy.
Cassidy. Who, in your opinion, does a good job supporting and promoting the left or even woke ideas? What do they provide in the conversation, and why do you find them helpful? Oh no.
Come on, Ben, you've got to have some. You've got to you've interviewed the other side.
I do, and I just there's something I thought it was a liberal until I saw liberalism go evergreen. So I'm like, I don't trust any of this stuff. I guess Brett Weinstein, he keeps on calling himself progressive, but I'm like, okay, what does that mean? Like you want a central, you have it all figured out, so you can implement this centralized kind of mechanism of government to cause everybody to act in a way where it'll be better. Like to what degree is the left or progressivism about telling other people what to do, and to what degree do I want to be told what to do? Now that said, my first thought is, to what degree is conservatism about telling people what to do? A lot of it is. I mean, if you
Hmm.
look at conservatism, it's about telling other people what to do. Don't abort babies. Don't kill people. Don't do this. Don't do that. So, to what degree do I want a society with more or less rigid expectations of behavior? And to what degree do those behaviors make sense on a moral level, on an economic level, and then on I guess, all the various different policy levels that are between the moral, the personal, the personal and the moral, and then the economic, or the strictly just creating value and redistributing value, all those different systems. To what degree, what is the overarching story of expectation for that entire thing to work? To what degree does the left or the liberal work? And by to what degree, I mean, at what level of analysis does that actually make sense? And usually when I talk to leftists, they're looking at the world on a systemic level and on a statistical level. Like that seems to be where the critique is situated, right? And then when I
Hmm.
talk to conservatives, it seems like they tend towards more the personal level of analysis. And to what degree can you link all those to be together? To what degree can you actually be a centrist and understand how to interpret phenomena, social phenomena, from the personal to the absolute utter sociological? And what way of thinking can tie all those different things together? I don't know if that's left or this right. I think that right has more preservation, left has more progress, right? I guess tonally, aesthetically. I still don't know what my own politics are because I try to see everything from the right level of analysis. And so and I have not been able to create a sustained model in my head or believe in a single left or right interpretation for everything. I'm not there yet. Get back to me in 15 years if I'm still doing this.
Okay, yeah, we'll have you back in 15 years then. So, okay, so I'm going to go over to Cassidy. Unfortunately, is not in the chat anymore. She was earlier, but I guess she no chance to clarify that, Cassidy. So I'm going to go over to Nolan's. Hello, hello.
At that point, will you be allowing to comment from the crowd?
Oh, yes, I was going to at the end. Um, is there something pertaining to what Benjamin said that you would like to address?
Well, I'm remembering conversations here about a year ago where uh, a gentleman named Nick used.
Semi Joe, I'm just going to stop because I'm having a really tough time hearing you.
Yeah, the
Oh,
connection is really poor.
is it better now or is it so horrible?
I know you're
Okay,
saying something and I really want to engage, but I can't
I'm gonna pick
understand
up.
you.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
Okay. Sorry, Semi Joe. I will give a chance at the end. That
How about
closer
now?
to,
Is
I
that
do
better?
want to get, oh, that is better. Okay, so if you have something like right now, particularly regarding what Benjamin was talking about, I'll give you a
Yeah.
chance to say it.
So a year ago, Nick laid down a model I thought was real nice, where he juxtaposed authenticity with credibility. And I heard Benjamin using that word 10 minutes ago to describe, the importance um, of how his manner of being um, can impact his audience. And so, in that sense, it's trying to position or poise himself and putting a high value on authenticity. So it's like the spirit of Benjamin. And if the spirit of
Hmm.
Benjamin is right, then the words and the narrative and so forth will land and get to the root of things, the root of the person.
Mm-hmm.
And Nick juxtaposed that with credibility, which had more to do with the sort of the articulation, the narrative modeling of that authenticity. So the truth, and that sort of brings up ways in which someone can be wrong in the way they're right. And technically, I guess you could say someone could be right in the way they're wrong. So their words and logic is wrong, but their heart is right.
Mm.
So I'm thinking back to that question about the wokeism. It seems like a lot of wokeism is pushing back against a type of intellectualization that has uh, it's not necessarily encouraged, but it's created an environment that's sort of predatorial in a way that can objectify the world, which in some part is what critique is doing. And so they're leaning hard instead toward a kind of authenticity that, even if it's not true, it's at least authentic. So I'm wondering if Benjamin has a way in which he's actually sympathetic to what's underneath a lot of this wokeism, insofar as it's
Authentic?
placing value on authenticity, even if at times it's deeply irrational.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. I was going to say that they repeat themselves so much, but I'm like, don't I do that all the time? Don't we all just have 3 or 4 things that we say over and over again? The weird thing about this is that I've covered enough of this that I don't want to cover it anymore. But you have these Zoom meetings with these people, these college professors or these people's on these boards or whatever. And then the quote unquote woke person comes in here and lays down the law of what we're going to do. And they all sound the same. Every single person sounds the same. And when the struggle session is going to happen. It's like, okay, now they're going to do this. Now they're going to do that. So they're acting out this fabricated or prefabricated way of being in the world. That the problem I have with it is that it uses all this moral language, and it leans into this kind of authentic-ish sort of repertoire of language, but that everybody's using the same words over and over again in the same sentences and then following the same behavior over and over again. And most of us are drones. I'm drone probably 95% of my 95% of my time. I'm just repeating something that I already have, right? So there's maybe like 2% of my product that's new or that's actually novel and true at the same time. So I'm not saying that repeating something over and over again isn't authentic, because that's just how we are. Very few of us are actually truly authentic and truly meeting every given phenomena with an open heart and really deeply listening to everything that's happening, and then kind of just receiving the correct thing to be in that time. Most of us have these models where we say, okay, this will work for most of the time. A lot of the woke stuff, at least within bureaucracies, is filled with bureaucrats who can sit through these endless, interminable meetings, do nothing, and then tell everybody what to do. So on the level of the institution, Wokeness, so called, is an absolute, it's just gum in the works. It doesn't matter if it's authentic or not. It's irrelevant to the outcome of the education institution of the government. If you look at Washington's woke task force, the Office of Equity, they literally want to do nothing. They literally say that whiteness needs to be dismantled, and whiteness has to do with being on time, being task oriented, getting things done. And they say, well, why not just come in whenever you want, like they do in South Africa? Walk in, be really authentic, and just come in. Everybody stops what they're doing. How's your day going? They actually say this, that they want to disrupt and dismantle functioning systems and replace it with something that doesn't function, because that would be more authentic. I'm going off the rails because you can't really judge if an individual is being authentic or not. And you can't really judge if a ideology or this social movement is authentic or not. I guess you can say that there's instances where people are reacting from an internal pressure to do good. There's a lot of do-gooding in there, but we all know that do-gooders are some of the worst doers out there, right? That's why we call them do-gooders.
Well, I'm going to fit in a question because you brought up whiteness. Yeah. I'm just going to fit that in here. Right. So why does woke culture hate white people or whiteness? I'd say that they hate whiteness, or not hate, but yeah.
Well, if you look at the word whiteness, it doesn't actually make any sense because it's not about white people. Oh man, it's so disingenuous. So you want to say, okay, are they being authentic and disingenuous at the same time? And which one's at the head of the pile on that one? We're anti-racist, and that's why we're going to be vilify this thing called whiteness, which is based on race, but it doesn't have to do with white people. But if you actually look at what they're actually talking about, they're actually talking about productivity. They're talking about meritocracy. They're talking about excellence. They're talking about anything that excels above anything else. It's aesthetically, it's absolutely bankrupt. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little passionate.
Okay. I'm going to do a little pushback because sometimes in a meritocracy, people can get left behind.
And what do you do?
That's all I have to say, I guess.
Well, you have this. Hello, can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah.
So what you have is a countervalent value in your culture to balance meritocracy. You have to have a concept of charity, and that's why really solid Christian versions, the Protestant version, has been so successful because it's countered this. The meritocracy with charity, that you give alms to the poor, you lift up your brother, but you don't do that. Do you do that centralized? Do you want the government to do that? That's the question. Do you want like a centralization of this charity? And then when you have modern bureaucracy doing these charitable moves and these moral moves and adopting all this pseudo-moral language about equity and justice, which has nothing to do with what they're actually supposed to be there for, but everything has to be about that. And that's the weird thing about how openly viral wokeness is that we have to make everything about this. This needs to be taught in this needs to be the basis of everything. This way of being in the world, this way of equalizing outcomes, going for justice, has to be under everything else. So they really want to rewrite the lowermost code of everything in society. You get away with meritocracy insofar as meritocracy is employed by people with charity and big hearts. And there has to be something more than just the material world in order for that to make sense. That's why the Christian order is so profound. It's that you render yourself up to God. You have to lift yourself up by your own bootstraps to a certain degree in order to reach that grace. There's some sort of constant interaction between work and faith, or maybe not faith, that word we'd have to have a long conversation about, but work and grace, or will and grace, right? Between
will and
my
grace.
exertion and the gift that I give. And when I receive a gift of insight, when I receive a gift from God, whatever that be, or when I am gracious for the life and the success that I have, I want to also naturally exercise that giving and kind of model what God is in my mind, which is something that's giving me grace. I want to give that grace to other people. So you still have the meritocracy, and then it's lifting everybody up through charity. So that's what you'd have to do.
Okay, so I've been given in the woke worldview, one more thing, clock to remind me that we have half hour left, and I have not gotten through all the questions. So I'm going to try to hurry us all up, if that's okay. Are you okay, Benjamin, if I hurry up your answers a little bit? Or maybe
I had one more point.
maybe could
I just had one more
you
point to finish that
give
up.
a shorter answers so we can get it all in?
No, we'll just end when we end.
Okay.
We'll just end when we end.
So okay, this actually leads in really well, and I'm going to ask maybe a couple more questions still from the written ones, but I do want to give people who are out in the audience a chance to give their verbal
Well, why don't we
questions
go there?
too.
Why don't we
Okay, but I really wanted to
spend
ask
the
this
last
one
half
first though,
hour?
because I
Okay.
think
right.
it'll be good. Okay, so Jeff P's question is, what is your spiritual faith, belief system background?
Oh God, I
That's
can't
what I
answer
wanted to
that
ask.
now.
I got it in.
Let's do short answers. Okay, let's do the most profound question now, but answer it in 3 sentences.
Okay.
You have to look between the lines, both for my political views and for my spiritual views. You have to read between the lines. Ultimately, it has to be manifested in the net. It has to be manifested in the net.
You're being so. I will not be pinned down.
That is a really huge question, and we have to go back and talk about belief.
I
We have to talk about, I would have to reconstruct the entire argument that I've been making. So I'm prepared to do that, but I can't do that in a rush setting. So I'd rather to
You're right.
maybe
You're
come
right.
back
Okay,
on another
my bad.
channel.
My bad, everyone.
And
I just
go
wanted
towards
to
that.
get.
That's fine.
I just wanted to actually see
I know.
how you would approach it. Okay,
Hey,
so
Andrea, that was my
yeah,
question. I just wanted to jump in and it was more of a kind of a biographical question, just a historical background. The tail end
yeah.
of it was, how would you define where you sit now? But just more curious about kind of your journey and where you came from. But if we don't have time for that, that's fine too.
Well, if we can slow down, I can't do that.
Yeah,
in
okay.
a rush
I
setting.
was hurrying way too. Okay, Rick just gave me the. It's okay if we go over time. So my bad for putting the hurry vibes out. So continue on. Hello.
Okay, so hey, can you hear me?
Hi.
I was just taking a break to relax.
Okay.
So
Okay.
the development of that lower level of the self that I have and that I foster and that I try to be aware of, that comes about through like the story of my life and the actions that I've gone through, or the events in my life best describe that, because the spiritual entity that persists throughout time, that is in the container Benjamin, and in the body that you see on the screen or hear in the microphone, is a human being that's been shaped and molded developmentally by a bunch of accident. And I guess that I have a spiritual practice that I found in 1998 that has been the closest thing to a direct source of what I experienced when I was a child. When I was a child, I had a variety of different religious experiences or spiritual experiences within the context of the church. When I hit puberty, that kind of went away, but I was always longing for that. And then when I hit young adulthood, I went in search of that very fiercely, because I didn't know how to be myself or build myself on my own terms and authentically without that first principle. And that first principle couldn't be a story. It couldn't be an idea, because every idea and every story comes from the level of mankind. And I want something deeper or higher than that. I want something that precedes all of the inherited faith and all of the complications that my mind puts on things, all of the disappointment and all of the excitation of my emotionality, which is unstable. There's all these different instabilities that I am made of and that the world is made of. I want that first experience. I want that in the beginning. That in the beginning would have to be something that I could hear. It would have to be something like when you are going in and you're trying to write a song. That's probably the best way of putting it. For a couple years, I was lost in my life, and I ended up working with children on a playground. And I had no more ambition. I had written probably 6 or 7 novels. Everyone blew up in my face. I had a relationship that I had invested a lot of my belief into, and that broke. And it broke a lot of my intention and a lot of my will when that relationship broke. For some reason, I wed too much of myself into that relationship, and I was just gone. I was done with life. And I ended up on a playground working with 2-year-olds, and I'm like, well, you have to do something, you have to do something, you have to do something. So I brought in a guitar, and I'm like, okay, I have to have an ambition. So let's make the biggest, smallest ambition. What's the biggest, smallest ambition for me? I want to create a nursery rhyme that will persist on the playground and the children will teach themselves. I want to create a song that the children will teach themselves, that no adult will ever teach a child after I do, right? So there's just these certain songs, maybe ABCs, but there's these certain nursery rhymes or playground rhymes that are still around, that have been around forever. If you can make one of those, then that's the greatest, smallest ambition that I could do. So I just started playing guitar and looking for a song and looking for a song. So what you do is you start to just fiddle around the process of creativity. I'm going to map that onto my spirituality. The the listening for that song, the listening for that which makes sense, it doesn't come from anything that you know. It comes from accident. You just listen into music. And once you start to develop the capacity of listening into music and just playing around with music in your head, you realize that songs are everywhere and there's an infinite amount of songs. And for those 2 years, I created like 200 songs or something like that. Just all these songs, like, okay, this one, this one, this one. And they're a variety of quality, and they're not music per se, like something like a Pink Floyd album or something. They're just very simple songs, but they're all different because there's all these different songs. And so what I wanted my spirituality to be about would be to perfect that listening, to be about being in a place, in a state where I could listen to that tide. And that tide has all these different tonalities to it. It has all these different levels to it, like a Dante Inferno to Paradiso. Like when you're listening to the world, reality has very dense aspect, very angry aspects, very horny or sexual aspects, very gracious, giving, very inventive. But underneath all of those different states is that which can connect to all those different states and put them in the proper place. Because the human being put in the proper place, standing before God, standing before the ultimate ground of being, and resting open that light that's shedding down, the human being, all those different aspects of the human, from the most hellish, the most selfish, to the most divine, are all put together. And that's what the human being is. The human being spans heaven and hell. And so to be in a correct spiritual relationship with reality would be able to connect with any given portion of reality and tie that into the whole, and make that make myself as a being transcend, or kind of transient throughout all these different aspects. And so my spiritual group, it's called Subud, Subud. I found that in 1998 through a fluke, a bunch of different experiences that I won't get into now. But I found that, and I heard in that the listening that I was seeking. And it had no religious organization on it. It's not a form of belief. There's no litany. It's just this contained experience, this kind of this portal, this standing in this resplendent kind of grace pouring down, and then everything builds back up from that. So that's my in the beginning, and that's my list. Hopefully that answered your question.
Does anyone have any questions that, and if I haven't gotten to your question and you are in the chat and you would like to just say your question or a new question, I would like to give you guys, open up the floor to you guys.
Popcorn time.
Don't be shy. Come on.
How close is the church to being what you just described of a place for listening? Thank you.
The church, huh? Which the church are you talking about?
Come on, Sam. We need more.
Yeah,
Oh, no,
you can
not
take your
Sam.
pick.
Is that Flight? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, this is Flight. Yeah.
Sorry, you sound too much like Sam Adams. Go
Yeah.
on, Flight.
Yeah. I guess whatever churches you have had personal experience with.
Mm-hmm. Any church? Well, that's the thing. So within the church, I guess church service, I'm gonna have to remember all of my. Can somebody say hi? Just because I switched my audio. So can you still hear me?
Hello? Hi, yeah.
You can hear me.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we
So
can hear you.
there's different is Paul still here? Because he could probably lay out how church services are formed. Like there's the whole liturgy about the, like the Bible reading, the testimony, the songs, the worship, then the sermon, and then another song. And then you go through that whole process. And there's probably different points in that. If everybody that's producing that and participating in that is participating in a sense of listening to the Spirit, then the whole thing's filled with Spirit. There's no place in anywhere that's not filled with the Spirit. There's only human beings that are turned off to that or turned on to that. So I suppose I would challenge all churches to return to that first principle place, return to that in the beginning, and start everything from there, and always be returning to that and teaching people experientially to be that way. And then when they go from church into life, then they can bring that listening and then know properly how to be guided, how to hear the proper song to that proper instant when that child is totally screaming and you know just what to say or just the right tone of voice to put that child at ease, or to extricate yourself from an argument that you somehow got into. Like that's what church should be about, is perfecting that part of ourselves. And then of course all this different knowledge and tradition and community on top of that, and then the worship aspect on top of that, all those different things. But ultimately I would think that you would want a church to produce human beings, and a human being is the entity that knows how to operate optimally in every given environment. That's ultimately what a human being is. And I think that church serving that form of human being, which would be about the being level of the human, would be the challenge of the church to do. So I don't know if any church does that.
That is a very good question. Paul Vanderklay, do you happen to have any thoughts? Or maybe you can cover it when you guys talk.
I have lots of thoughts, but I'm here to listen today.
Okay. I just had to see. Okay, is there any other brave souls who will speak up?
I do have one question I'd like to ask. Like, if I think, to me, I see like some of what's going on in wokeness is a realization of the withdrawal of participation. Like there is an underlying layer in wokeness that is pointing towards something that is actually good, which is attempting to, well, that's what the awakening part is trying to make us see that we have withdrawn from participation. But it doesn't really have any it doesn't have any good ideas about how to move toward final participation. I'm talking in Barfieldian terms here, but like, do you see that like potential in, and maybe is there any kind of way that can be dialogued about so that we can move forward more productively in a less conflicty culture war kind of way?
Final participation. Is that what you said?
Yes,
like
final
that.
participation as opposed to original participation, which I think wokeness wants is a return to original participation, as opposed to a move toward final participation. So they just want to attack withdrawal and deconstruct it and try to recover a past that's unrecoverable.
Could you define the state of final participation?
Yeah, final participation, like Barfield said that the difference between final participation and original participation is that the movement toward final participation is a conscious choice. So we don't default into participation the way that our ancestors did. We have to make a conscious choice to move into this, and it's through poetic diction and poetic theology ultimately, I would say, is the way that's accomplished.
This sounds like a great kind of interview, kind of bound. This is a whole, like you opened us up to an entire playground. I want to break it down into like a in the beginning and then at the end, like these apocalyptic thinking modes of being, and then there's I guess Genesis modes of being. And I've been advocating for Genesis modes of being, but ultimately my evil plan is to create the apocalyptic mode of thinking. Once I master the origin, then I can master the end. I'm not there yet, and so final participation. But just getting back, I think you are pointing to something, and that's ultimately how to defeat the long march through the institutions is to get people to get back to participating in those institutions and sitting through all those meetings and showing up and running for city council and running for your school board and really participating. Because yes, wokeness advances because people are, there's a fire under their butts or in their hearts to get this done. And so they're getting it done. So on that basic level, they are participating and they're doing something great in the world because they're at least doing something in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then somehow they want everybody else to do it. So me, myself, Gen Xer, reality bites, totally apathetic. The world is just running on its own. I don't need to participate in it. I'm just going to go into my corner of the world and decadently create my decadent piece of art that's impossible to read, right? I'm going to completely remove myself from the world. I was in that state for 20 years. And then I was brought into participation without my will, without my wanting to be, and thrust into participation by wokeness. So wokeness woke me up and put me into contact with an actual audience. So in a sense, I owe it my life at this point. I owe it myself insofar as myself is interacting and participating with other people. Now, if you watch the arc of my channel, historically, Benjamin Boyce went from somebody who was detailing woke to criticizing woke, now trying to counter it in a non-woke, non-combative way by building these interview series. I think that the interview series is my major contribution at this point until I'm ready to unleash my apocalyptic final participation. But I appreciate that.
I just want to give you credit for being like for more than most operators in this culture war space. I really think that you've never lost the desire to dialogue. Like I think that, and that's commendable. So kudos for that.
Well, thank you. I'm just always running up against my own ignorance. So I run towards other people to help me solve that.
I think that's I think that we should have more people do that. So I think that is a good thing to be modeling. Is it okay? So unless you had more to say about that, Benjamin?
No, I was just riffing. I'm at the point in the conversation where I'm just going to be thinking very poetically and kind of not answering the questions by making a bunch of word associations. That's where my brain turns to mush. So I apologize for that.
That's what we wanted. That's what we're here for. Is that the real voice? So I have been asked to. I wasn't sure if I was going to ask this question, but because I think it's about me, so I thought it was boring. But whatever. Okay, so the Magic Dragon has asks if you have a theory as to why I, as in me, Andrea with the bangs, am dressing vintage. But I think that we can make it like, why do people look to the past in times like these?
So Andrea's actually she's going trad. She's going full trad. Aesthetically, she's reverting to a prior state of gender roles and trying to recreate a lost era and milking that nostalgia button for all it's worth. I don't know. I'm totally making up as I go along. Why do you dress then did you not say that you wanted to participate creatively in the space of social media, and so that was something that you wanted to do to add to culture rather than to, I guess, be a barnacle on on the ships that are contesting some sort of wild cultural sea?
Well, okay. I did the acting before I did the thinking with regards to that, with the old-fashioned dress.
So what was that? What was that? I'm going to do that spark, that pre-conscious spark. What was that moment that, what moved you to do that?
Honestly, the gals on Twitter were like, I got a beret and I did some artsy photo, like turtleneck Audrey Hepburn style
Okay.
photos. And
Yeah.
I put them on Twitter, and some of the Twitter gals were like, you should do a vintage Instagram account. You should, actually, they said, you should monetize this. I'm
Oh,
like,
there you go.
so that was sort of the spark that maybe I could not monetize it, but just
Feedback.
do it as a fun thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So you got feedback and you ran with it.
Yeah. So that's the sort of surface. I think, honestly, Benjamin, do you remember I interviewed you last year about, I think the feminine was part of one of the things I talked to you about. And I've been trying to understand the feminine for a while now. And I think I think it's probably deeply rooted in that, understanding myself, understanding, and speaking of identities, understanding my role as a woman, but as a Christian, as a mother, as like, oh, but my kids are starting to get a little older, and I'm starting to try to find the identity outside of being like, quote unquote, just a mom. I don't like saying that necessarily, but that's the easiest way to say it quickly. So I think that's probably what to do. I really don't want to take up this time from you, because I know people are here to listen to you and not me. So
very briefly riff on that. There's this story that I wrote, or this poem, this epic poem, and it's about Father Time having this interaction with this little girl, and it's very archetypal, and there's all this stuff going on in it, and there's all these statements that Father Time talks about time and about questions and about answers, and it turns out that this little girl, she becomes the oracle, and people go to her, but instead of going to her for answers like most oracles supply, they go to her to learn their question. Everybody goes and stands before her, and she can articulate their question. And once that question's articulated, then there's nothing more to do with life at that point. The questing part of life is done, and you go into the next stage of life. You go from your young self to your middle-aged self, where you say, okay, I understand my question now, and it's time to implement it. So I was just thinking about how the artistic process has worked for you in this. You had this motivation, you had this quest, I want to do something, but then you kind of stumbled upon, well, there's this action that I'm doing, but what am I actually asking? What am I asking? And once you have that question, you work it out and you work it out and you work it out, you work it out. And then you have this entire field that turns into this body of work, or it turns into this work. Which is the mature way of engaging with the world, where you're no longer, and this is the problem with the whole questing monomyth, that's a young man's game, or a young person's game. What is the middle-aged person's game? It's having a skill, is developing a long-standing conversation with through work, through some sort of work or art or craft. That's how we go on a quest, but it's a different sort of quest. So I just wanted to articulate that.
No, that resonates. Oh, guys. Okay, so Joey's asking if there's any questions that you have for me, but again, people, let's not waste time on me. I'm here all the time. So I guess if you have one question, Benjamin, you can. You don't have to. We can move on if you.
I'm sorry. I'm not in interviewer mode.
I know you're not in interview mode right now, and that's fine. So I will be happy to move on from that. But thanks, Joey. Nice try. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to articulate to Benjamin? Again, I can go back and read them, but if you are, right now, if you want to have a chance to articulate it yourself, you can.
Am I coming through all right?
Josh?
Okay, I want to press you, Benjamin, on my question. It was earlier on about mythology and scientific belief. And I'd kind of like to rephrase it a little bit, especially with some of your answers to questions throughout the afternoon. And I would maybe like to rephrase it in that, do you think that all belief is mythology? The stories we tell ourselves to make sense of reality, is it fair, in your opinion, to compare it to what people in times past, the stories they used to tell themselves to make sense of reality? I'm trying to push towards a yes or no question, but I understand if you don't want to answer that way.
Well, how would that operate? How would that ancient way of understanding the world lead to or still be active in this current, supposedly non-archaic way of viewing the world?
Well, that's just what I'm trying to get at. I don't think it is. I think it's a false assumption on our part that we think that the stories we tell ourselves are higher and above the older stories.
Well,
does that make sense?
I think that the stories need to, the stories change as our environment changes. The stories have to adapt, or certain parameters of stories have to adapt. So we no longer want to go around and other people when we have so much abundance. It would be actually a waste of our resources to get too tribal, actually. And like the story of capitalism is that you transcend all those differences by making it about trade, right? So that kind of storytelling doesn't work until you have the technological advances of being produced more than you can consume, so you have something to sell, and then also the technological advances of traveling those things. So once those technological advances are put into place, then you can have this functional kind of story that resolves previous stories, right? So tribalism can be less tight or less severe, and we can relax certain tendencies that we had in prior ages that we needed to do in order to protect our resources. So under different environments, we can tell different stories, but under certain pressures, those stories will return. So when we have Germany, Weimar Republic Germany, you have the conditions for a very severe mindset to come into play. And that severe mindset that was beset by disparity went back to a very incredibly powerful tribal aesthetic that then gained the modern tools to implement that, which led to just terrible horror upon horror because of the implementation of a tribal way of viewing the world with a modern, so-called modern technological way of interacting with the world. I hope that wasn't not enough a yes or no for you.
Josh? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm trying to process that. Yeah, no, I'll let it go. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I have a question on the last part about like the Nazi regime being a reversion to tribalism. That's interesting. Like, what would you make of what would you make of Jacques Ellul's contention that what actually went on with the Nazi regime was an extreme representation of the system of La Technique, as opposed to descent into tribalism? That it was actually like the force of the expression of, you know, the technological society of modernity and the spirit of the technician that actually like allowed the death camps to function.
Well, and that's the question. The death that you're talking about, the functioning of this, but I'm talking about the primordial state that allowed them to use those tools in that way. I'm again, like when you bring up the Nazis, you know, what are you actually doing? Are you ending the conversation? Or are you trying to add to it? I'm just interpreting that as a very particularly graphic example of trying to say that you have tribalism plus this functionality. So I don't know if you were talking about that which pertains to the tool or that which pertains to the user. And if that's a useful distinction, or if the user was just maximizing technology for the sake of what? Technology mastery? Is that the contention?
No, that's a great distinction. I just yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm actually going to, I do want to go back to opening the floor, but I do want to make sure this question gets asked because I am curious as to what you think about it. So I'm just gonna do it. So Nolan's question is, Jonathan Pajot has argued, utilizing examples such as Moana, Wonder Woman, Captain Marvel, etc., that today's society is actually too masculine. Wait. Oh, because yeah, so that it has lost touch with and devalues the feminine. Do you agree with this conclusion? Is it, well, wait, is it not saying that they're trying to make it more feminine? Oh, no, right. He frames it that he turns these women, he doesn't utilize their femininity. Sorry, by he, I mean the movie makers. They turn them into men, basically, yeah. Okay, So I totally butchered the question. I apologize, Nolan. But did you catch that, Benjamin?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a very big question. And when speaking about the feminine, you have to gather input from the female. And then you have to ask, to what degree does the female represent the feminine in her answering to a man about the feminine? And is she using her feminine wiles to distract from the reality of the feminine? Because the feminine is very tricky. It's a very, very tricky thing. And I'm speaking mythologically. I've had conversations about this with Jonathan Peugeot himself, where he states the feminine as the question, the feminine as the floor of being, the feminine that provides that which is being, like on a very primordial level. Then you have the feminine insofar as you have the reproductive function as it is embodied in the female. What does that mean? What is the significance of that? Then you have the feminine as it is embodied throughout literature. And then when you get into that domain, you have to look, well, what genre of literature are we talking about? Is the feminine as it is expressed in biblical stories different than the feminine as it expressed in fairy tales, and different as it is expressed in heroic epics, and different as it is expressed in fantasy novels or romance novels or modern novels and then postmodern novels? So the feminine palette is this huge, very nebulous thing. And then you have to counterbalance it with the masculine in order for it to make sense. What I think that Jonathan Peugeot is trying to point out is that what you have is a bunch of heroes with boobs bolted onto them. And now we're representing the feminine as being able to act as the masculine, right? And I think his contention's on an archetypal level, because that leaves the feminine out. It's just making a woman acting like a man. But they do that because the way that we've implemented stories in our culture is kind of masculine centric. Again, it's about the quest. And the quest is archetypically male. You have the Harry Potter character. You have that archetypal protagonist, which just has kind of basic masculine-ish functions. Now, if we had a different form of storytelling, would that give more room to the female? Would we not have to have a tradition of feminine stories in order to have the design language understood by enough people to want to watch that in droves, right? Would a feminine type story lead to a blockbuster? Most blockbusters are built on a masculine way of a masculine order. And of course, if you get gender critical, you can tear all those categories apart, right? They're very nebulous, very fragile categories that you have to handle very softly. And everybody has to arrive at this conversation in good faith and listen to it poetically for that to happen. So in order to represent the feminine, are there feminine representations of the feminine? And to what degree can a male, as an artist, represent the feminine representations in a feminine representative light? How do you do that? And then how do you give egress for men and women to contact that? How do you contact the internal, eternal feminine? That's the question. So you'd have to actually go and look at the content that females generally like to consume. And I think that the paragon of feminine art, like the pinnacle or the paragon of feminine art, would be the novel, especially as written by Emily Bronte and Jane Eyre. Like, that's where you have the female really landing on the scene of literature. I say that a lot, and I'm probably wrong, but that's what I think when I read that book. I'm like, finally, at last, in literature, we have room for the female, because before then, all of our art forms didn't have enough words to contain her. We didn't have the printing press. We didn't have the technology to get her, to abstract her, because of how complex that female mode of meaning making is. You really need a lot of space for that to actually adequately work itself out.
Well, you've even talked about old wives' tales as a mode, a feminine mode that is relatively unexplored, at least in media.
What do you mean by old wives' tales?
They're not like blockbuster style epic quest stories. It's the stories that are told from mother to daughter, from generation to generation, at the watering watering hole, or like at the well.
Yeah, gossip. basically.
In
a way.
Yeah,
I did want to say one more thing. There's
Um,
nothing wrong with females acting in a male capacity. And there's nothing wrong with Mona doing the Mona thing or whatever female thing. But you do have to understand that that's not the feminine. That's a representation of a female acting out the masculine story. And also our culture has a problem with using the male as the archetype or the yardstick for female value. And that's criticism that I made of feminism. And I got into a lot of hot water and then produced a couple of really excellent interviews on that very topic. So I'm interested in continually expanding and exploring my understanding of that, and also understanding how to best and adequately convey that to people so that they have the most possible ways of expressing their artistic ambitions through narrative, literature, and other art forms.
Okay. I think that we're
at time.
Well, we can wrap up in the next few minutes. I wanted to give people last chance because there are some really good questions that I didn't get to, and it wasn't because I didn't want to. I just was
Andrea,
trying to go.
You got to leave them wanting. You got to leave them wanting. You got to give that space.
Well, okay, if people out there, hello, people out if you have a question that you wrote or that is a question that is not written, but please, you have a chance now. And if let other people who haven't spoken, if you want to give them a chance. So come on, folks, get your question out now. Don't be shy.
Will this be published somewhere? The video feed that I've been pretending is watching me.
Yep. Yes. Rick says that it wasn't live today, but it will be. He's recording it, and then it will go on PVK's channel. I'm guessing shortly.
Oh wow. Oh wow. Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Great. I think I said a couple of things that I want to go back and see how I said, because I think I need to write them down. So thank you, everybody, for letting me speak out loud. That's basically what I do. I'm always a work in project, and everything is a rough draft. If I don't treat it that way, then I never finish anything, as can be seen in the 20 novels that are in boxes off camera right now.
We'll be waiting for your apocalypse. Okay,
hey, Semi Joe.
So,
there you go.
Well, first, Ben, I've appreciated your work. I've had probably 100 hours plus, and thank you for being here today. We did meet some time ago in Seattle, there at a Peugeot conference. But to me, the best of what the woke movement mode is rooted in looks to me very similar to you in terms of the way in which we were talking about final participation, about Subid.
That sounds so destructive.
So I'm wondering to what extent you would agree or disagree with it. I mean, I know
I
on the surface we see the woke. I think the seed of the woke movement has to do with that realm of trust upon which whole systems are built on. So you can have a trust that is born out of that movement of belief, which is another way of participation, involving both the the left and right brain, the feminine, and then on that participation, institution structures can be built, and if they're built in such a way that the house, a home, the hearth begins to go out. It's a sort of a archetypical role that a woman tends the hearth. It's a house, a home, and so that feminine mystique is rebelling, and it always doesn't take a nice shape. It can be batshit crazy, but the essence of it might be justifiable, or it's a proper move to say, hey, there's a quarrel between the spirit of finesse and the spirit of techne, or the spirit of geometry. And spirit of geometry's responsibility to sort out what it's like to be the proper answer to the question. And you strike me as one who has been extremely cordial in all the people you've interviewed, even though you might disagree with politically but you've never abandoned your respect for their personhood, which strikes me as something that a movement in the direction of deep reverence. And I gotta believe that if there's anything positive at the bottom of this wokeness we found there, you can find all sorts of negatives.
Yeah.
And so anyway, my question to you is, could it be that you're one of the finest representations of what woke, properly understood, can look like?
Thoughts, Benjamin?
Oh my God, if I ever claimed that mantle, I would be culturally appropriated, canceled so hard. That's one
you
thing
said it was
that,
very much a part of your making. I mean, of
You
your.
said you got woke up. They woke you up.
well, again, I have to disappoint everybody that's looking for an answer. There's certain things that a person can't say about themselves. There's certain ways in which I am a part of a story, and I cannot claim the mantle of the moralist or the interpreter of the story that I'm acting out. I can pin my hopes and try to elucidate my methods and my means and my meanings and my intentions. I can do that properly, but I can't give a good self-evaluation in the midst of my work. And maybe I should. Am I doing good? Am I doing good enough? Where can I get better? I return to a certain way of trying to be conscious, I guess, which is a certain way of trying to be woke, and a certain way of holding people in my gaze and holding information in my gaze that can allow people access to deeper ways of viewing that person. Can I do that? Can I keep on doing that? How do I do that? How am I doing that? And are other people, is that infectious enough for other people to start doing that too? That's great hope. That's a great hope of mine. If I can contribute anything, it's a way of being. Yeah. So thank you.
Well, I think that we will let you go, Benjamin. Thank you so much for being so gracious with your time and
Thank
yeah,
you.
gifting us with your presence.